It was so good to get here on roads that were free of ice and snow and sleet. It was wonderful to look at this site that I use, 511 PA, and see all the roads showing green, not icy white. What a joy. We have a long history of resisting change, but we've always done it that way. It has long been our battle cry when faced with the new. When the country was being electrified and the White House right along with it, well, President Benjamin Harrison and the First Lady often slept with the lights on because they were afraid if they touched the electrical outlets, which were new and strange, they would be electrocuted. They would have preferred to stick with gas lights or candles or anything familiar, anything that had been used for a long time by a lot of people, and therefore just must be safer. At the other end of the issue of changing with the times, today's youth, as my wife informs me, are exasperated with their parents and other adult relations. Every time they get an actual physical phone call on a cell phone, they know it has to be a parent or an older relative, because everybody knows that everybody texts. Nobody calls these days. But we've always called, comes our startled response. When it comes right down to it, we just don't like change all that much, at least not at first. And yet, here we are in the season of Lent, when Jesus calls us to decide for ourselves that we must change the way we do things, just like he insisted on change in the temple in Jerusalem. To set the scene, during the festivals of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, the city of Jerusalem's population swelled dramatically from about 100 to 200,000 to 1 million people, with pilgrims arriving from across the nearby Galilee and well beyond. The second temple, the first had been built by Solomon and destroyed long ago, was designed to handle this influx. Stones weighing up to 400 tons had been used in the temple complex's construction. The plaza upon which the temple was set covered the area of 6 modern football fields. The temple itself was built with shining white marble and gold, with impressive bronze entrance doors. It was said that on a bright day you just couldn't look directly at the temple for fear of being blinded. It was an architectural marvel meant to honor God and all people. Within the bounds of the temple grounds, the long-established custom was to have merchants selling animals for the necessary sacrifices, and money changers ready to exchange the various coins of the realm for the more appropriate coinage, the half shekel required for the temple tax, and the standardized currency used to pay the merchants for the animals. It was business as usual, providing pilgrims with needed services and the officials and merchants with a profit. No doubt this system was a well-oiled machine from which any kinks had been worked out a long time ago. Into the hustle and bustle leading up to Passover amidst the vast throng of people and the amazing architecture of the temple grounds came Jesus, who had performed in the book of John his first miracle at the wedding of Cana, stayed with his family in Capernaum for a few days, and had now arrived with so many others. Unlike all the rest, however, when Jesus saw the mercantile activity on the temple grounds, he was furious. He made up a cord whip, mayhem ensued, sheep and cattle were driven away. Money changers' tables were overturned, coins scattering everywhere. Sellers of doves were told to get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. Jesus could not tolerate exploiting both God's temple and the people of Israel in the name of prophet and under the cover of the law of God. Jesus exposed a long-time abuse for what it was. Jesus insisted on a very different priority for temple activities. The place the nation of Israel considered the epicenter of religious life, symbolically the center of the entire universe, the meeting place of heaven and earth, where everything that happened gained extra significance, was being misused. Instead of the temple being a place for true worship and service to God, the leadership had turned it into a service industry. In the midst of all that power and glory, bearing the weight of long tradition, Jesus stood up and said things must change. What a challenge for everyone who witnessed or heard of this. How would people respond? As with the people of Israel back in the first century, we too are impressed with towering edifices and are comfortable with things that have been around for a long time and have become familiar. Even some things that don't always work to our advantage. However, if we look back at Malachi 3, 1 through 6, the prophet foretells the messenger who would come like a refiner's fire, clearing away what was wrong. Jesus did come. Jesus pointed out this great wrong in the temple itself, at the seat of Israelite power and authority, in the house of God. Malachi warned he will come to bear witness against the oppressors, the liars, the abusers, and those who thrust aside the alien. He calls them and us to change our ways and return to God. There are no doubt a great many injustices Jesus would call us to change in our world today. Some of them would probably take us as much by surprise as they did the vendors, the money changers, and the customers waiting to use their services in the temple. Here are a few injustices that don't come as a surprise. High poverty rates at home and abroad, the all too great number of hungry and homeless people, the vast and growing disparity in income, the mistreatment of those who are not like us and are not from around here. This is a problem rearing its head globally. The diminishment of civil rights, warfare intent on grabbing someone else's land, or on forcing others to follow some narrow and brittle ideology, and a great many more, most of which seem lamentable but an ordinary part of life in this rough and tumble world of ours. Yet Jesus' action in the temple leaves us uneasy. Jesus is calling for us to overcome our reluctance toward change. Jesus calls us to follow his example. It is a call that is hard to ignore today, as hard to ignore as the scattering animals, jangling coins, and confused cries of the vendors on that memorable day long ago. Jesus' actions were a challenge to all those around him to make a decision for themselves as to who he was and how they should respond to what he had done. Jesus' disciples were very impressed with his angry response in the temple. They recalled the words of Psalm 69:9, "Zeal for your house will consume me." This psalm recalls the psalmist's faith, ridiculed by others around him. This was the psalm of a righteous sufferer. It was appropriate as the temple leadership's response to Jesus' actions were anything but receptive. They did not grapple with the actual violation Jesus was graphically pointing out, but rather demanded to know by what right and authority he was overturning tables and driving out merchants. The answer Jesus gave was cryptic and misunderstood. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Prior to the temple being built, Herod had stockpiled materials for construction for 8 years. 10,000 workers had been busy with its construction, including 1,500 specially trained priests who built the Holy of Holies all by themselves. Construction had been going on for decades. To these leaders, such a claim was ludicrous, even blasphemous. No one could reconstruct such a wonder of architecture so quickly. And who would destroy it? Well, the Romans would indeed destroy that temple in 70 AD, after some hesitation, actually. Jesus was speaking of himself, however, answering their question more completely than they imagined. When they crucified him, destroying the temple that was Jesus, the true presence of God in the world at that time, he would rise again in 3 days. The disciples would recognize this in hindsight. Jesus was also speaking of the system of sacrifice and the presence of God focused on a single, specific location. These were on their way out with Jesus, his actions and his teachings. God was not going to be seen to reside in this beautiful box much longer. Where once the temple had been a place for healing and forgiveness, now these divine acts were coming from Jesus instead. Further, God would not be staying among only one people. Jesus was breaking God out of the temple box and breaking down the barriers between Jews and Gentiles. As Jesus would tell the Samaritan woman in Sychar in chapter 4, verse 21, a time was coming when God would not be worshipped on their local mountain, Mount Gerizim, or in Jerusalem, but would be worshipped instead in spirit and truth, everywhere. The temple, source of awe, veneration, and power for Israel's religious leaders, would not be necessary much longer. Misuse of the law and of the people in the name of the law here in the temple would not stand. Everyone present, everyone reading John's words, every one of us must decide who we will follow. If Jesus is to be followed, we must follow his example of brave, justice-seeking, barrier-breaking behavior as well. We need to decide to become agents of change. And I suppose it didn't occur to me when I was writing this, but I should say, and to think outside of the box. Jesus, like John the Baptist before him, calls people to repent. That is, to radically change their behavior. We are all called to a childlike faith, full of wonder and far less doubt in or resistance toward what Jesus calls us to do. Jesus' act against the temple merchants was symbolic of the change needed to be a citizen of God's kingdom. It is something we must all decide to do for ourselves and together as a community. We are also called not to be distracted from the issues at hand, as the temple officials were, asking for Jesus' authority rather than dealing with what Jesus was showing them was abusive and wrong. We are called not to be sidetracked in our efforts to follow where Jesus would lead and take on the pressing justice issues of our day. We are alerted by John in his placement of this episode early in Jesus' ministry, and from the reference to Psalm 69, that when we do follow Jesus and stand up against institutions and practices that are not just, as Jesus did, we will face real resistance. We will be considered foolish. Authorities will look around in puzzlement and ask by what authority we stand against such common practices. What sign can we offer? What proof do we have that God we worship remains active? What sign that following Jesus is not a ridiculous effort? Signs? Oh, there are signs. Jesus was raised after 3 days. We follow him who was raised, who lives, who calls us to decide, who calls us to work for what is right in this world of ours. We follow in a long line of Baptists who have worked against what was commonly believed for issues of justice instead in the world. We Baptists have always promoted change in society, supporting freedom of religion, abolition of slavery, advocacy for freed African Americans after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, women in church and societal leadership, ecological responsibility, and much more. Our first missionary was a freed slave from Georgia, George Liles, who established churches in Jamaica in 1770. In the early 1800s, the Judsons headed for Burma, extending our reach, our good news, and our call from Jesus to follow and change ever further into the world. Today, American Baptists continue to work for justice in an unjust world, breaking down human barriers that would divide us, and working with or providing local food pantries, homeless shelters, programs for teens and community support, refugee and immigrant resettlement programs, an end to the worldwide slave trade, and much more. Jesus calls us to decide who Jesus is to us, if we should follow him and his ways, and if so, what justice will we seek? Jesus calls us to abandon the cry, but we've always done things this way, and to work for change in the world, kingdom change. Change for justice, change that shows in our actions that we really do love God and our neighbors, all our neighbors. Jesus is calling to us. Jesus wants us to decide for ourselves who we will follow. In what kingdom will we claim citizenship? And who will we serve? This challenge from Jesus gives us a lot to consider for Lent this year. Let's spend a few moments in silent reflection. Amen. Our hymn of response is number 596, I Surrender All, verses 1 and 4. Please rise as you are able.